Michael Reaves had been living with Parkinson's disease since the 1990s, and as his symptoms worsened, he increasingly worked with co-authors, like his frequent collaborator Steve Perry. Beginning with Coruscant Nights III, Patterns of Force in 2009, Reaves co-wrote 3 Star Wars novels with Maya Catherine Bonhoff. Reaves and Bonhoff had worked together on the urban fantasy novel Mr. Twilight in 2006, and while Bonhoff isn't credited on the cover, she is thanked in the acknowledgments, and she confirmed her involvement with the novel on her blog at the time. As with the previous 2 Coruscant Nights books, I never read this one, even though I really enjoyed Darth Maul's Shadowhunter. However, just as my brain could not get the title of the second book right, I keep wanting to call this one Patterns of the Force. I think because when I think of Patterns of Force, I think of the Star Trek original series episode. Is the title meant to be a reference to that? So first, a brief summary. In the depths of Coruscant, Jedi Knight Jax Pavan champions the causes of the oppressed while trying to stay hidden from the Empire. But as Jax works to uncover the secrets of his father's death, the truth catapults him into the inner circle of a secret plot to assassinate Emperor Palpatine. And unfortunately, Darth Vader is actively searching for the young Jedi. We begin with Jax Pavan having a dream, a memory of a fellow Padawan at the Jedi Temple, Anakin Skywalker, giving Jax a stone for safekeeping before basically shriveling up and burning before his very eyes. Jax doesn't know what really happened to Anakin, just assumes that he died on Mustafar. And then a member of Whiplash arrives, and it's someone that we met all the way back in Darth Maul's Shadowhunter, Tudin Saul, who Jax's father, Laranth Pavan, entrusted I-5 to. The book says he also entrusted the Sith holocron to, but that's not right because Laranth still had it when he contacted Palpatine and was killed by Maul. Anyway, Tudin Sal has a plan to assassinate Emperor Palpatine by using a droid, because a droid's intentions couldn't be sensed in the Force. This idea of a plot to assassinate Palpatine is very interesting, but unfortunately doesn't really go beyond the talking about phase, as Jax constantly ping-pongs back and forth between, should I-5 do this? Should I-5 not do this? Meanwhile, Darth Vader instructs an Inquisitor named Probus Tesla to stop searching for Jax Pavan and instead search for a droid named I-5YQ. Tesla encounters a young man who's extraordinarily powerful in the Force, tries to get him to join the Inquisitors and then capture him, but the young man escapes and then runs into Jax and Laranth, and they bring him to safety. And Jax begins to think, maybe this is why I'm on Coruscant. Maybe I'm meant to teach others how to use the Force to pass on what I've learned. Meanwhile, the Eloman Rhinann is still searching for the Boda. And actually, an awful lot of people are asking around about the Boda. The Boda being a drug that had miraculous healing powers and was the source of conflict during the Clone Wars, except it mutated so it wasn't going to work anymore. And one of the few remaining vials was given to I-5 by Jedi Barriss Offee. Jax tries to teach the young man Kaj, but he's very angry and very impulsive, and it's not going well. However, they discovered that the Kamazi artist who was murdered in book number 2, that his light sculptures, some aspect of the crystal power source, blocks the Force. Which seems especially helpful when they're sheltering a young man who just can't stop emanating the Force in a way. After one of Kaj's outbursts, they have to move him to a new location, which is the Kamazi artist's former studio. And then Rhinann and the Zeltron Dejah, who was the artist's partner and who's basically funding Whiplash right now, take him for an ill-advised walk, and they're set upon by Tesla and 2 more Inquisitors, and Jax and Laranth have to rush to help them, and 2 of the Inquisitors are killed, but Tesla gets away. And we learn when Tesla reports back to Vader that there's a traitor in Jax's midst. I-5 shows Jax a message from his father. Den Dhur, the Celestin journalist, decides maybe he should go back to Sullust because Coruscant's too dangerous now. It all culminates in Laranth trying to take the young man Kaj to meet the leader of Whiplash, only for them to be captured by the Inquisitors. And also, I-5, you can sense him in the Force now. That seems to put the kibosh on the assassinate Emperor Palpatine plan. Anyway, Jax pretends to be an Inquisitor. He gets Rhinann and Dejah and I-5 into the ISB office, where they are confronted with a trap set by Vader. He tortures Laranth, and what he wants is the Boda, and he wants the Sith holocron, and he wants that rock that Anakin Skywalker gave Jax. Apparently Vader wanted to use instructions in the holocron to use the Boda and the rock, which I think is pyronium, to, I don't know, become very powerful in the Force. It's revealed that Dejah is the traitor because she wanted to get access. Everyone wants to get access to the Force in this book. Anyway, she's killed. Rhinann is killed trying to throw himself out the window with Vader. Vader takes the Boda and has a real bad trip. At no point do Jax and Vader duel like is depicted on the cover of the book. Members of Whiplash, including Den Dhur, who did not go to Sullust, come in and get Jax and Laranth and Kaj and I-5 and spirit them to safety. And then Jax and Laranth have a conversation about their feelings for each other, but they decide it's a no on the relationship front, and they repair I-5, and Jax has a vision of the cosmic force, and he's like, I know I'm supposed to be on Coruscant after all. So of the 3 Coruscant Nights books, I think that Jax was at his most likable in this one. I felt like in the first book he behaved like a brat. And in the second book, his attitude was much better. He showed a lot more potential for leadership skills, even if I thought that his detective investigating skills were subpar. And here, it was really nice to see him interacting with this young man who's super powerful in the Force and trying to pass on what he's learned and try to help him in any way he can. He also finally realizes that Dejah is coming on to him, and he doesn't really want to encourage that. Of course, that doesn't end up well for Dejah, but, well, she's the villain here. I guess I was surprised by how many people survived the confrontation with Vader, because it's Darth Vader, and also this is not very long after Order 66, and Jax isn't a particularly powerful Jedi, and to be honest, I think the idea of Jedi hiding out on Coruscant is a very bad idea if you want to avoid detection from the Empire, but what do I know? He survived, Laranth survived, and there is a 4th Coruscant Nights book, although it's not marketed as such, which presumably tells more about Jax's story and what happens to him. I continue to like Laranth, even if I think her character background is a little strange. It's more the fact that this idea of gray paladins who don't use lightsabers, who only use blaster weapons, is cool, but never picked up again by anyone else anywhere else, which makes it feel a little like we're in Michael Reeves' own personal Star Wars universe, which interacts with other aspects of his personal universe, but not so much with the greater Star Wars universe at large. I guess I like Laranth. I just wish we'd gotten more of her and more of people like her. Den Dhur is absolutely one of my favorite characters in these books. He's probably tied with I-5 for my favorite of Reeves's characters, but he doesn't have much to do here other than feeling unsure about what's going on, having fond memories about the Celestin performer that he met in the Medstar duology, and maybe he wants to go back to Sullust and settle down with her. He doesn't in the end, but what I liked so much about the Medstar books was Den Dhur, the hard-hitting journalist, and he hasn't done very much journalism in these books. I think the most he had to do was probably in book number 2, where he was also investigating the murder. But here, he's involved with the underground maglev that Whiplash runs, getting people to safety. But other than that, he's also one of those just sitting around until we have a quick, short action sequence, and then there's more sitting around in doubt. The development that I-5 is recognizable in the Force, that you can sense his presence in the Force, again, is a super interesting development, but not something we really saw picked up outside of Reeves's books. I-5 has such a distinct personality that I would argue he hasn't just achieved sentience, he's achieved individuality. I'm not sure that droids would be thought to have souls, but if any of them do, I think I-5 would be one of them. I do love that when Tudin Saul comes, and I-5 very much does not trust him, but he says, well, we have this plan to assassinate Palpatine, and I-5's basically just like, yeah, cool, I'm in. And it's more Jax, the one who's like, no, absolutely not. And then, okay, and then no, and then back and forth and back and forth. Rhinann wants the Boda still because he wants to touch the Force. Dejah's a villain because she also wanted to touch the Force. Okay. I feel like when we got down to the very end, and we knew there was a traitor, and I'd pretty much narrowed it down to Rhinann or Dejah, because it's obviously not going to be Den Dhur or anyone else, but I feel like her motivations are a little... Dejah was originally introduced seemingly as the typical noir femme fatale, and I wish we'd seen more aspects of that to her character, because as it is, she just comes on to Jax a lot, and I guess when he didn't respond, turned to the Inquisitors instead. Our bad guys in the first book were Black Sun, and Shizor, and Card of the Nadiji. In book number 2, it was Aura Singh, and in this book, it's the Inquisitors. I do wish that we had had Inquisitors in more books, because as it stands, having different secondary villains in each book, obviously Vader's the big bad, but secondary people that are doing his bidding, having them be like distinctly different might be a callback to the prequel trilogy, but to me it felt more like villain of the week TV episodes. So we're introduced to Probus Tesla, who's an Inquisitor working for Vader, and at one point he's joined by 2 other Inquisitors, and he thinks very highly of himself, but also I feel like the Inquisitor's presence here adds to the timeline confusions that started to pop up in the first book. We are at most a year after Order 66, but we already have Inquisitors who are not just running around Coruscant, but have somehow been trained, because Tesla talks about being trained under another Inquisitor, and then he killed that Inquisitor, and stuff like this makes me wonder if Michael Reeves originally intended for the Coruscant Nights trilogy to be set further along in the Dark Times era and not so close to Revenge of the Sith, because another aspect of this timeline doesn't match up is the Boda that Darth Vader so desperately wants. Barriss gave the Boda to I-5, and at most she gave it to him 2 years ago. But at one point towards the end, Jax says something like the Boda is 2 decades old, and that's why it gives Vader the bad trip. No, it's not even close to that old. All I can think is that maybe the mutation that made Boda not effective anymore is affecting this vial in a different way by making it just crazy strong, but the implication definitely seems to be that it's crazy strong because of its age, and that age just makes no sense for the story. The Boda and the Rock gives a reason why Vader is looking for Jax Pavan, but Vader's such a scary villain. And again, I just think the fact that so many people got away from this encounter with him is somewhat improbable to me, considering what happens to basically other Jedi survivors who encounter him at any point before A New Hope. So you may have noticed that Patterns of Force totally dropped the noir detective angle. I guess we have more of a spy thriller type story here, and we do have the who's the traitor, but I feel like part of the allure of the Coruscant Nights trilogy to me was that it was really sold to me as noir in Star Wars, hard-boiled detective stories in Star Wars. And honestly, we really only got one in the second book, and I felt like the mystery plotline was the weakest part of that story. I think that the Coruscant Nights trilogy had so much potential for showing us the dark underbelly of Coruscant, something that Michael Reaves did so well in Darth Maul Shadowhunter, but for whatever reason just didn't work in these books. So clearly, let's get into the issues, since I've already just dropped into them naturally. My biggest issue with Patterns of Force was just the fact that it felt like it both dragged and wasn't long enough. Patterns of Force is 288 pages. For comparison, the first novel in the trilogy, Jedi Twilight, was 350. There were just so many scenes of people hiding out, discussing things. Like the plot to assassinate Palpatine never got off the ground because they literally would not stop discussing it. How many times can you go back and forth on this and not start making actual concrete plans? The revelation about the Kamazi artists' sculptures, that they block the Force, was cool. And there was a little bit of how does that work? Let's delve into it. But most of the time it was just like, oh, let's put Kaj in the middle of the sculpture. Guys, this is not a long-term solution. There's a lot of moving people around, often for very silly reasons, although you could argue that when Rhinann and Dejah take Kaj out, it's because Dejah's the traitor, she wants him to be caught. But we had a lot of that, just like sitting around talking, waiting, and then when we did have action scenes, they were very short, and I felt like those could have been fleshed out. And I think the worst example of this was the climax, which felt particularly unclimactic and rushed. We have Kaj brainwashed. We have Laranth being tortured. We don't have really much of an explanation into how Jax gets his Inquisitor disguise. Just he gets it. Now he's pretending to be Inquisitor. Now I'm gonna get you all in, and oh no, it's a trap. Again, probably because the cover set up false expectations, but I thought there's gonna be this big showdown between Jax and Vader, and there just wasn't, because it's like Vader tortures Laranth and is like, give me the things, and they give him the things, and then he puts them in a thing in his chest plate for analysis, but then he's tripping bad, and it just felt like a disappointing end to what could have been such a promising trilogy. And I think, too, it's the way that very little is concluded at the end. Tesla gets away. They get Kaj to safety, but he's brainwashed and doesn't remember anything. And they're like, oh, well, we'll just send him here. Maybe they can help him. Will any of these threads be picked up in book number 4? I don't know. The fact that I'm hoping for them to be touched on in the 4th book feels like to me like this conclusion just didn't conclude enough. If I'm still wondering, well, what about this and what about that? I feel like I have such expectations for each new Michael Reaves book I read, but it feels like I'm just getting diminishing returns each time. That Darth Maul Shadowhunter was the pinnacle for me, and then with the MedStar duology, I really liked book 1, less so book 2. Death Star had some high points and some low points. And then Coruscant Nights just felt like wasted potential, that even the parts I like could have been so much better, and I wish they were. So in short, Patterns of Force by Michael Reaves and Maya Catherine Bonhoff was a mixed bag for me. There were so many ideas that I loved the concept of I-5 now being sensed in the Force. A plot to kill Emperor Palpatine using a droid so he couldn't sense the plot against him, but it just didn't all come together for me. There were a lot of slow bits, but then in comparison, the action bits felt rushed, and I really think they could have been fleshed out more, especially when it came to the conclusion, which frankly didn't conclude very much. Jax has definitely grown on me as a character from book number 1, but I still wouldn't put him in my top tier of Michael Reeves characters. I just feel that for a trilogy that marketed itself as being about Coruscant's dark underbelly during the dark times, when to be a Jedi on Coruscant was to be hunted, this book just wasn't dark and seedy enough. I'm glad that I finally got to read this trilogy, that I got to see I-5 and Den Dhur again, because I love that droid and I love that little guy. But I feel like my expectations for these books were always higher than the actual books themselves. So next time I'm going to be reading the third of the Clone Wars tie-in novels. This one bringing in some expanded universe characters into the story as well. No Prisoners by Karen Traviss.